The hum of the fluorescent bulbs in the Houston Fertility Clinic is a frequency I learned to tune out years ago. Today, it rings in my ears. I stand in the narrow hallway, holding a yellowed piece of paper printed on thick clinic letterhead. The date at the top places this document 7 years in the past. My thumb slides over the center crease, where someone folded it away into a dense manila folder. I stare at a single word circled in dark ink near the bottom margin. Sterile. The letters blur, then sharpen. As a senior risk actuary, I spend my working hours measuring probabilities, assessing structural vulnerabilities, and predicting failure rates for corporate clients across Texas. I quantify disasters before they happen. But looking at this piece of paper, my professional metrics dissolve. To understand why I am standing in this cold hallway, holding the printed proof of my husband's destruction, you have to rewind 72 hours. Before I tell you how a single text message demolished a 7-year marriage, welcome to Panavengeance. This is the place for stories that crack the foundation of everything you thought you knew. I want to ask you a question before we begin. How old are you right now? Drop your age in the comments below. I ask because I am 36 years old, and it took me every one of those years to learn that the most dangerous lies do not come from strangers. They come from the people holding your hand. Let us get into it. It began on a Tuesday afternoon in Dallas. The Texas heat baked the pavement outside our living room window, creating shimmering waves over the asphalt. I sat at the granite kitchen island, nursing a lukewarm coffee, reviewing a commercial liability portfolio on my laptop. My phone buzzed against the stone counter. A text from Julian. I glanced at the screen, expecting a reminder about picking up dry cleaning or confirming our dinner plans. Instead, an image loaded. Julian sat in a vinyl hospital chair wearing the crisp blue button-down shirt he claimed he needed for a multi-day compliance seminar in Austin. Cradled in his arms were 2 newborns, swaddled in pink and blue striped hospital blankets. His head tilted downward, his expression softened by a raw, unguarded devotion I had not seen since our wedding day. Beneath the photo sat a brief line of text. Daddy loves his girls. The message was intended for my sister, Harper. Harper, who borrowed my clothes, who leaned on my income when her graphic design contracts dried up, who sat on my couch drinking my wine while I cried over negative pregnancy tests. A misrouted data packet, a transmission error that slipped past his firewall. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the tile backsplash. My pulse maintained a steady, measured rhythm. The quiet in the kitchen stretched on unbroken, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Instead of breaking down, my professional training hijacked my nervous system. I cataloged the visual variables. I noted the timestamp on the digital monitor behind his shoulder. I read the partial barcode on the hospital wristband secured around his forearm. I estimated the weight of the infants. For 7 years, I navigated a private, isolated hell. 7 years of plastic sharps containers sitting on our double vanity. My lower abdomen stayed permanently bruised, mottled purple and yellow from daily hormone injections. We sat in endless waiting rooms filled with soft music and hollow-eyed couples. I carried the solitary, crushing weight of a failing body. Every month when the blood tests came back negative, Julian held my hand. He played the stoic martyr, absorbing my silent tears. He would stroke my hair and tell me his love was strong enough to carry us both. He watched me apologize for my biology year after year. I looked back at the glowing phone screen. He looked rested, triumphant, a man who had just secured his legacy. The timeline formed a clean, undeniable trajectory in my mind. 9 months ago, I suffered my last, most physically draining miscarriage. I spent 3 days in a surgical recovery room, mourning a heartbeat that faded into static on an ultrasound monitor. While I lay in that stark white bed, bleeding and apologizing to a husband who sat beside me looking appropriately solemn, Julian was planting a new life with my own sister. This was no fleeting mistake. An affair is a brief lapse in judgment handled in cheap hotel rooms. Twins are a sustained, calculated operation. They require prenatal appointments, dietary changes, nursery planning, and a staggering amount of hidden financial resources. The numbers did not align with the life he presented to me. The ledger of our marriage was corrupted from the inside out. I locked my phone. The screen faded to black, casting my own reflection back at me. I closed my laptop, setting the commercial risk files aside. The risk was no longer external. It was sitting in a hospital room in Austin, holding 2 daughters that shared my bloodline, but not my name. It was time to initiate an audit. I did not confront Julian when he walked through the door. Confrontation is a release of built-up pressure, and I needed the pressure to remain contained. I needed to map the exact perimeter of the breach before sounding the alarm. My home, a sprawling 4-bedroom contemporary build in the Dallas suburbs, ceased to be a sanctuary. It became a compromised data server. I spent the weekend running a quiet forensic sweep of our shared life. I pulled toll tag logs matching the recorded timestamps against his digital calendar. I downloaded joint credit card statements dating back 3 years, categorizing every gas station purchase, every restaurant receipt, every unexplained cash withdrawal. I moved like a phantom through my own house. I waited until Julian fell asleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic display of innocent exhaustion. I sat in the cold blue glow of my laptop screen at the kitchen island, running cross-reference checks on IP addresses logged by our home router. Nothing glaring stood out immediately. Julian was a meticulous man. He kept his financial footprint light, utilizing what I assumed were secondary accounts or hidden cash reserves. But careful people always cast a shadow. They just do not expect anyone to look for it. The tension shifted from the digital realm to the physical on Sunday morning. I was standing by the espresso machine watching the dark liquid drip into a ceramic cup when my phone vibrated against the marble counter. A message from Harper. Harper has always been the chaotic variable in our family equation. 3 years younger, a freelance graphic designer who treats deadlines as mild suggestions and financial responsibility as a myth. She relied on my stability. She drove my old cars. She lived in a downtown apartment where my name sat on the lease as a guarantor. I opened the message. The text read, "Hey Nova, do you still have that emerald silk dress? The wrap one. I have a friend's baby shower next weekend, and nothing fits right. Can I borrow it?" I stared at the glowing words until the letters seemed to detach from the screen. The emerald silk wrap dress. I bought it during my second trimester 3 years ago. It was a celebratory purchase, an expensive garment meant to drape over a growing stomach I prayed would sustain life. I wore it exactly once, before the severe cramping started. After the hospital stay, I pushed it to the back of the guest room closet, encased in a thick plastic garment bag. Harper knew exactly what that dress represented. She was sitting in the hospital waiting room when the doctor told me the pregnancy was no longer viable. The psychological cruelty of her asking to wear the garment that mapped my most profound physical failure to a baby shower was staggering. It was not thoughtlessness. Harper was selfish, but she was not blind. It was a subtle flex of dominance, a test to see if I was still the compliant, accommodating older sister. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed a single word. Sure. I walked up the hardwood stairs, counting my steps to ground myself. I entered the guest room and pulled the plastic bag from the dark recesses of the closet. The silk felt cool and heavy against my skin. It smelled faintly of cedar and forgotten hope. I laid the dress flat on the mattress, smoothing out the rich green fabric. Then I walked into my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I retrieved a small, coin-sized GPS tracking device, originally purchased to monitor checked luggage during international business trips. I carried the tracker back to the guest room, along with a travel sewing kit. I turned the dress inside out. With a pair of sharp surgical scissors, I made a precise half-inch incision in the thick inner lining near the hemline. I slipped the tracker into the dark void between the silk and the backing. I threaded a needle with dark green thread and stitched the gap closed. My hands did not shake. The needle pierced the fabric with a satisfying, rhythmic puncture. I packed the dress in a pristine white cardboard box, wrapping it securely in crisp tissue paper. I printed a shipping label and dropped it off at a courier facility an hour later. I was no longer a grieving sister or a betrayed wife. I was a risk actuary tagging an unstable asset. Julian returned from his Austin compliance seminar on Monday evening. He walked through the front door, dropping his leather duffel bag in the foyer. He smelled of airplane coffee and subtle cologne. He kissed my cheek, wrapping his arms around my waist, holding me with the practiced ease of a man who believes his foundation is secure. I leaned into his touch, measuring his heart rate against my chest. Normal, steady, the physical discipline of a practiced liar. I cooked dinner that night to maintain the baseline: pan-seared ribeye, asparagus roasted with garlic, and fresh lemon. We sat across from each other at the dining room table, the soft amber glow of the chandelier casting warm light over his face. He poured a heavy glass of Cabernet and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He complained about the seminar, the dry lectures, the rigid hotel accommodations. I listened, nodding at the precise intervals required to maintain the illusion of an attentive spouse. Then he took a slow sip of his wine and leaned back in his upholstered chair. He shook his head, letting out a low, cynical laugh. "You will not believe the situation with Mark from the legal department," he said, cutting into his steak. "Mark just found out the kid he has been paying child support for over the last 4 years is not even biologically his. The ex-wife faked the paternity test." Julian chewed his food, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "Can you imagine? Paying for another man's kid? What a gullible idiot." I set my fork down on the porcelain plate. The metallic clink echoed in the quiet room. A cold electric current traced its way up my spine. Julian sat there swirling the red wine in his glass, passing judgment on a man deceived by a woman holding a child that did not belong to him. Julian sneered at the concept of blind trust. I looked into the eyes of the man who spent the last 9 months building a secret nursery with my sister, the man holding 2 infants in a hospital chair 100 miles away. I smiled a thin, practiced curve of the lips. "I suppose some people just do not look at the data until it is too late," I said, keeping my tone light. Julian laughed, agreeing with me, raising his glass in a casual toast. He took another bite of his dinner, unaware that the network he thought he controlled was already breached. He believed he was the architect of this situation, the smartest person in the room, manipulating 2 women to serve his needs. I picked up my fork and continued eating. The food tasted like ash, but my appetite for the truth was ravenous. I needed to know the exact dimensions of the structure he built in the dark before I brought it down. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A silent notification pulsed against my hip. I reached into my pocket and silenced the screen without looking. I knew what the alert meant. The tracking device hidden inside the lining of an emerald silk dress had just pinged its location upon delivery in Austin. Harper had accepted the package. The physical tether between my quiet Dallas dining room and their hidden life was established. The audit was no longer confined to digital records and old bank statements. It was moving into the real world. Julian continued talking about his upcoming schedule, outlining a sudden need to return to Central Texas by the end of the month for more corporate training. I poured myself another glass of wine and let him talk, logging every word as a future point of leverage. I retreated into the dark quiet of my home office. The silence of the room surrendered to the steady, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Every keystroke echoed in my mind, resembling an old mechanical adding machine, calculating the cost of betrayal. As a risk actuary, I trust empirical data over spoken promises. Vows can be manipulated, shaped to sound like devotion. Mathematics lacks that capacity for deceit. The primary mystery remained unsolved, hanging heavy in the Texas night. How does a mid-tier logistics director fund a parallel existence without triggering a single alert within his marital ledgers? I extracted the banking statements spanning the preceding 36 months. I constructed complex pivot tables categorizing our shared wealth. mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery runs, mutual fund contributions. The columns balanced with pristine accuracy. The man I married had not diverted a single cent from our shared pool. My trained eyes never caught the discrepancy because the discrepancy did not exist on our monitored grid. He was intelligent enough to know I audited the primary accounts. Therefore, he built his clandestine operation in the shadows. If he refrained from using our capital, whose funds did he drain? I bypassed the joint banking portals and initiated a hard credit inquiry utilizing his Social Security number. A spouse possesses certain administrative privileges when navigating digital firewalls. The comprehensive report loaded, filling my monitor with stark black text. The imaginary clicking in my head amplified. A new liability logged. The document revealed a man actively dismantling his own foundation. Julian had systematically decimated his independent retirement portfolio. He liquidated his corporate investment accounts, incurring severe early withdrawal penalties and crippling tax obligations. Draining his future proved insufficient to finance his present. The screen displayed a cascading sequence of high-yield personal loans. These were originated from alternative lenders who ignore standard income requirements as long as signatures are secured at exorbitant interest rates. Some of the annual percentage rates hovered near 30%. He leveraged his individual equity to the absolute brink of insolvency. I traced the routing numbers associated with those disbursements. The capital flowed outward, covering out-of-pocket prenatal care boutique hospital delivery fees and a luxury residential lease in a distant zip code. He bankrupted his own identity to afford my sister. The sheer scale of his fiscal recklessness shifted my objective. I was no longer managing a cheating partner. I was dealing with a toxic asset destined for imminent default. By Wednesday morning, I sat in a glass-enclosed high-rise office overlooking the sprawling Dallas skyline. Across the polished mahogany table sat Marcus Vance, an elite family law attorney renowned for dismantling complex estates with surgical precision. Marcus offered no sympathetic platitudes. He operated strictly on evidence. I slid a leather-bound dossier across the desk. Inside rested the credit reports, the loan origination documents, the toll tag logs, and a printed screenshot of the hospital photograph. I do not desire a standard separation, I stated, keeping my vocal tone flat and stripped of emotion. I require a zero-notice filing. I want the petition drafted, sealed, and ready to execute before he can shift another dime. Marcus reviewed the dossier, his gaze scanning the columns of hidden debt. Texas is a community property state, he explained, tapping a gold pen against the paper. Normally, courts divide everything down the middle. But what we have here is a textbook case of fraud and the community. He used community credit to enrich a third party. If we file, citing severe dissipation of marital assets, we can lock him out of the primary estate. He will walk away holding nothing but the shadow debt he created. I nodded, signing the heavy parchment retainer agreement. The legal trap was locked. I returned to our suburban house, maintaining the facade of a compliant, oblivious wife. An auditory hallucination of a ticking clock embedded itself in my consciousness. Tick. Another fabricated story. Tick. Another hidden invoice. Julian arrived home that evening complaining about gridlock on Interstate 35. I stood in the laundry room, holding a hot iron over his crisp white collar. The steam hissed against the cotton fabric, filling the small space with the scent of scorching starch. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me press the wrinkles out of his garment. He appeared so comfortable in his deception. He asked what I preferred for dinner, suggesting we order Italian from the bistro down the street. I agreed, running the hot metal plate over the cuff of his sleeve. The contrast between my domestic performance and the impending legal strike waiting in a downtown office building felt chilling. I was ironing the shirt my husband would likely wear to a deposition. He poured a glass of bourbon over ice and wandered into the living room, turning on the evening news. The ice clinked against the crystal glass, a sound of pure, unbothered relaxation. He believed he remained the master of his domain. He thought his financial maneuvering was untraceable, obscured by the daily routines of our suburban life. He assumed the graphic designer and the infants were secrets securely hidden in the vast expanse of the state. He stood in the center of a house he was about to lose, drinking liquor purchased with credit he could no longer afford. My phone vibrated against the ironing board. A push notification illuminated the lock screen, cutting through the dim lighting of the laundry room. The tracking device secured inside the lining of the emerald silk dress was moving. The digital pin on the map showed the garment traveling westward, away from the urban sprawl, out into the rugged isolation of the desert. The target was no longer stationary. The geographic coordinates updated every 30 seconds, painting a clear path down the highway. It was time to see the investment he destroyed himself to build. The highway stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of gray asphalt baking under the relentless Texas sun. I drove a rented, slate-colored sedan. My personal vehicle featured integrated navigation syncing that Julian occasionally audited under the guise of routine maintenance. I left nothing to chance. The digital map glowing on the center console pulsed with a small green indicator. The emerald silk dress was stationary now, located in a gated residential community on the remote outskirts of Midland. The landscape outside the tinted windows shifted dramatically, from the towering concrete density of the Dallas Metroplex to the vast arid expanses of the Permian Basin. Solitary pump jacks dotted the flat horizon, nodding like slow mechanical birds feeding on the cracked earth. I drove in stark silence. No radio playing, no podcast buffering, just the hypnotic hum of the tires against the road surface. Harper always expressed a deep vocal hatred for the desert. She preferred the curated aesthetics of downtown lofts, the proximity to artisanal coffee shops and vibrant nightlife. The fact that she willingly relocated to this isolated, dusty oil town spoke volumes. She traded her preferred urban geography for a discreet stronghold funded by stolen equity. I bypassed the main security gate by closely tailing a commercial landscaping truck through the residential entrance before the metal arm could lower. The neighborhood consisted of newly constructed luxury townhouses featuring pale stucco exteriors, terracotta roof tiles, and zero lot line layouts designed for affluent privacy. I parked the rented sedan 3 houses down from the target address, pulling into the deep, cooling shadow of an oversized oak tree. The engine ticked softly as the metal cooled. I lowered the driver's side window a single inch, letting the dry, oppressive heat seep into the air-conditioned cabin. The townhouse stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It boasted a heavy iron double front door and a pristine 3-car garage. I sat in the driver's seat and calculated the estimated monthly lease based on the regional real estate market data I reviewed earlier. The figure easily dwarfed Julian's legitimate take-home pay. He was burning capital at an unsustainable rate. The financial collapse was not a probability, it was a mathematical certainty. 45 minutes passed. The quiet street remained undisturbed. Then a familiar silver SUV turned the corner. It pulled smoothly into the wide paved driveway of the target property. The engine cut off. The driver's side door swung open. Julian stepped out, wearing a casual white polo shirt and fitted khaki shorts, a stark contrast to his rigid corporate Dallas uniform. He looked relaxed, unburdened by the dual life he was maintaining. He walked around to the rear passenger doors and opened them wide. Harper emerged from the front passenger seat. She looked physically exhausted, but undeniably radiant, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose, messy knot. She did not look like the chaotic sister who routinely bounced between failed graphic design gigs and overdue rent notices. She looked like a settled, contented mother. Julian reached into the back seat and retrieved a bulky plastic infant carrier. Holding it by the sturdy handle, he lifted it with practiced, effortless ease. Harper reached into the opposite side and retrieved a matching second carrier. They stood together on the sunlit driveway for a brief, quiet moment. Julian leaned down and kissed her forehead. He smiled a genuine, open expression that I had not witnessed inside our own home for years. He turned toward the heavy iron door, carrying his secret legacy inside. Seeing that tender kiss, seeing the effortless domesticity he shared with my younger sister, triggered a visceral, physical reaction. The dry desert air caught in my throat, turning to ice. The leather interior of the rented sedan dissolved, replaced by the sterile, blinding white lights of a hospital recovery room. 9 months ago, the air in that memory smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton linens. The rhythmic, metallic beeping of a cardiac monitor filled my ears, charting the steady, inevitable failure of my 3rd trimester. I lay on a narrow mechanical bed, my body shivering uncontrollably under thin hospital blankets, mourning a heartbeat that the ultrasound technician could no longer locate. The physical agony of the loss paled in comparison to the crushing psychological guilt. I believed my biology was a defective, broken vessel. Julian sat in a rigid plastic chair beside my bed. He held my hand, his grip firm and anchoring. He wore a constructed mask of profound, stoic sorrow. I wept openly, apologizing repeatedly for failing him, for failing our future. He reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from my sweaty forehead. He looked deep into my eyes, delivering a performance worthy of an Academy Award. He whispered the words that cemented my unwavering devotion. "Do not cry, Nova. It is okay. My body is strong enough for both of us." The memory snapped back into the present reality with a sickening jolt. I stared through the windshield at the closed iron door of the townhouse. The hypocrisy of that hospital memory washed over me, stripping away any remaining trace of shared history or residual affection. Julian did not just cheat. Infidelity is a common weak transgression born of opportunity. Julian constructed a psychological prison. He weaponized my trauma to build his own twisted savior complex. He played the supportive martyr, holding the hand of his barren wife while cultivating a fertile future with her sister. He watched me drown in self-hatred and used my blinding grief as a smokescreen to cover his tracks. My hands gripped the steering wheel until the leather creaked. My knuckles turned stark white. I felt a fundamental, permanent shift in my internal architecture. Mere survival was no longer the objective. Escaping this fraudulent marriage with my assets intact felt insufficient. I required a systemic demolition. I reached for my smartphone resting on the passenger seat. I scrolled through the contacts and dialed the direct office line of Marcus Vance. The attorney answered on the second ring. His voice sounded crisp, professional, and ready for instruction. I told him to accelerate the legal timeline. The zero-notice divorce petition needed immediate filing with the county clerk. Furthermore, I authorized him to execute the emergency financial injunctions we discussed. Every joint credit card, every remaining mutual fund, every shared line of credit was to be locked, frozen, and rendered legally inaccessible. I wanted the financial guillotine to drop precisely when Julian attempted to swipe his debit card to purchase baby formula. I ended the call without waiting for pleasantries. The green dot on my tracking application remained stationary inside the stucco fortress. I shifted the sedan into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the desert neighborhood behind in the rearview mirror. The drive back to Dallas would take 5 hours. 5 hours to plan the exact moment the walls would cave in on the man who thought he could carry us both. I returned to Dallas under the dense cover of night. The rented sedan hummed along the empty interstate, carrying me back to a home that now felt like an active crime scene. The next morning, a Thursday, the atmospheric pressure inside the house shifted. Julian moved through the kitchen and hallways with a frantic, uncharacteristic energy. He pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the hall closet, the heavy zipper scraping against the silence of the early hour. I sat at the kitchen island, sipping a cup of black tea, watching him through the reflection of the dark oven glass. He claimed he needed to pack for an extended regional site visit. A sudden operational emergency required his presence in San Antonio. But his physical actions lacked their usual corporate precision. His hands moved too quickly. He checked his phone every few minutes, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the front window. I watched him pull a thick stack of $20 bills from his leather wallet, shoving the currency deep into the side pockets of the canvas bag. He was liquidating small sums. Cash leaves no digital footprint. My actuarial training identified the immediate risk. A man drowning in high-interest debt does not hoard physical cash for a standard business trip. He knew his financial house of cards was swaying in the wind. The predatory lenders were likely demanding payments he could no longer float. He was stockpiling untraceable currency. The variables indicated he was preparing to run. He intended to drain whatever liquidity remained in his grasp, load his hidden family into that silver SUV, and vanish into the anonymity of another state. I could not allow the asset drain to continue. The moment he walked upstairs to gather his toiletries, I carried my laptop into my home office and locked the heavy oak door. I opened the encrypted communication portal to my legal team. I typed a single, decisive message to Marcus Vance. Execute the freeze. Within minutes, the banking algorithms took control. The legal injunctions swept through the financial institutions with silent, ruthless efficiency. Every shared credit card deactivated, turning the plastic in his wallet into useless squares of plastic. The joint checking and savings accounts locked down, displaying a cold 0 available balance. The primary mortgage accounts froze. The financial guillotine fell across the digital landscape, severing his access to our shared wealth. Julian was currently standing in our master bedroom, zipping up a bag filled with loose cash, entirely unaware that his purchasing power had just been reduced to 0. I needed to maintain the domestic illusion just a little longer. I unlocked the office door and walked back into the hallway. Julian bounded down the stairs, slinging the heavy duffel bag over his shoulder. He kissed my cheek, the gesture feeling like cold metal against my skin, and walked out the front door. The lock clicked shut behind him. The house fell quiet, holding its breath. 10 minutes later, the silence shattered. My phone vibrated across the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The caller identification displayed a name I did not expect to see. Evelyn Alexander. My mother-in-law resided in a pristine, gated Highland Park estate. Evelyn was a woman constructed of rigid social expectations, tailored designer suits, and intricate country club politics. Public appearance functioned as her primary currency. A social scandal ranked as her greatest fear. We maintained a cordial, distant relationship over the past 7 years. She viewed my inability to bear children as a tragic flaw in her son's perfect life, a subtle blemish on her immaculate family crest. She hosted charity galas for pediatric hospitals, often looking at me with a practiced, pitying sigh. She never called me during the workday. I answered the call, expecting a cold, scheduled inquiry about an upcoming holiday dinner or a request for a charitable donation. Instead, I heard sharp, ragged breathing. The composed Dallas socialite was hyperventilating into the receiver. "Nova," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Tell me this is a clerical error. Tell me the bank made a mistake." I stood perfectly still, my eyes tracking the sunlight moving across the floorboards. The banking freeze. Julian maintained a legacy savings account tied to his mother's name, a remnant from his college years that he never bothered to close. The automated legal injunction swept through all accounts bearing his Social Security number, triggering an immediate security alert on her phone. She knew about the asset freeze. She knew about the impending divorce filing. I prepared a clinical response ready to outline the facts. I intended to explain that her golden son had diverted immense marital funds to support a hidden family in West Texas. I assumed she was calling to protect his reputation, to manage the impending fallout. Before I could form the words, Evelyn's voice broke. She was openly weeping, a sound so raw and uncharacteristic it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Please, Nova," she pleaded. "You cannot file these papers. You cannot let this go public. You cannot let him know yet." The words stopped me cold. The equation failed to balance. Why would a fiercely protective mother shield the wife over the son? Why was she asking me to keep a secret from Julian? Evelyn did not know about the desert townhouse. She did not know about my sister. She did not know about the twin infants. Her panic stemmed from a different source entirely. She was terrified of the divorce proceedings unearthing something else, something buried. I asked her what she meant, keeping my tone low and steady. I demanded to know why she was asking me to halt a legal process she should be fighting. The cellular line crackled with static. She let out a jagged sob, the sound of a woman whose carefully curated world was collapsing under the weight of a decades-old decision. "The clinic sent a letter 7 years ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the phone speaker. I should not have hidden it. A sharp click echoed in my ear. The call disconnected. I pulled the phone away from my face, staring at the darkened screen. The air in my home office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. 7 years ago. That timestamp aligned perfectly with the exact era of our initial fertility treatments. The era of my greatest physical pain, the endless rounds of injections, and the crushing, solitary guilt. The mystery pivoted sharply on its axis. The misrouted photograph of the infants was no longer the sole variable in this collapse. There was a deeper, older infection in the foundation of my marriage. Julian built a secret life in the desert, but his mother had engineered a secret right inside my own body. The narrative I believed about my own physical failure, the apologies I whispered in the dark, the grief I carried for nearly a decade, suddenly cracked wide open. The impending financial ruin of a cheating husband shifted to the background, replaced by a chilling new objective. I needed to uncover exactly what the clinic found 7 years ago, and why a mother intercepted the truth. The dial tone echoed in the silent office. I placed the phone flat on the polished mahogany desk. The digital clock in the corner of my computer monitor displayed 9:45 in the morning. My husband was currently fleeing toward the desert in a panicked attempt to manage a financial collapse. My sister was sitting in a luxury townhouse nursing 2 infants funded by predatory loans. Yet the epicenter of my destruction was not located in West Texas. The true origin point resided 240 miles south. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the house. I did not pack a bag. I did not leave a note. I merged onto Interstate 45, driving out of the Dallas Metroplex toward the humid coastal sprawl of Houston. The rented sedan swallowed the miles while my mind processed the variables of Evelyn Alexander. Evelyn operated her life like a highly curated museum exhibit. She controlled every narrative regarding her lineage. If a medical clinic sent a letter 7 years ago diagnosing a catastrophic reproductive failure, she would view that diagnosis as a public relations crisis. She would contain the damage. I gripped the leather steering wheel, replaying her ragged breathing over the cellular network. She intercepted a letter. She hid a fundamental truth. I spent the 4-hour drive cataloging the specific physical agonies I endured under the assumption that my biology was defective. The Houston Fertility Institute sits inside a sleek glass and steel medical pavilion. I parked in the adjacent concrete structure, navigating the familiar concrete ramps I used to drive up with trembling hands. 7 years ago, Julian would hold the passenger door open for me, offering a brave, tragic smile as we walked toward another round of bad news. Today, I walked alone. My footsteps echoed sharply against the tiled floors of the lobby. The air conditioning blew a steady stream of chilled artificial air, carrying the faint, distinct odor of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens. I bypassed the main waiting room, pushing through the frosted glass doors leading to the administrative wing. The facility director, a woman named Brenda Hayes, sat behind a broad reception desk, typing methodically on a dual-monitor setup. Brenda possessed the weary, guarded expression of someone accustomed to handling emotionally volatile patients. She looked up as I approached, recognizing my face from the years I spent weeping in her consultation rooms. "Nova," she said, her voice laced with practiced professional sympathy. "We did not have you on the schedule today. How can we assist you?" "I need the physical archive of my comprehensive reproductive file," I stated, keeping my vocal tone level and devoid of any emotional inflection. "I require the unredacted original lab results from our initial intake 7 years ago." Brenda stopped typing. Her professional smile faltered, shifting into a cautious grimace. She glanced nervously toward a locked filing room down the adjacent corridor. "Our standard protocol requires a formal written request," she explained, folding her hands over her keyboard. "Furthermore, the original intake directives on your joint account stipulate that certain disclosures require authorization from the primary guarantor." I stared at her, analyzing the bureaucratic shield she attempted to raise. The primary guarantor. During our initial treatments, Julian handled the financial paperwork while I underwent the invasive diagnostic procedures. He designated his mother as an emergency contact and a tertiary authorized representative to manage the billing logistics. Evelyn inserted herself into the administrative architecture of my medical care. "I am not submitting a formal request for processing," I replied, leaning forward slightly, resting my palms on the cool surface of her desk. "I am the legal spouse and the primary patient subjected to the treatments executed in this facility. You are currently citing a third-party directive implemented by a mother-in-law to deny a patient access to her own physiological data." Brenda shifted in her ergonomic chair. "Mrs. Alexander, please try to understand the privacy frameworks we have in place. I cannot simply hand over a historical file without the proper signatures from Julian." I reached into my designer handbag and extracted the heavy, embossed business card of Marcus Vance. I slid the card across the counter. The gold lettering caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead. "That is the contact information for my legal counsel," I said, my voice dropping an octave, honing into a sharp, clinical blade. "He specializes in dismantling fraudulent estates and prosecuting severe medical malpractice. If you refuse to surrender my unredacted file within the next 3 minutes, my attorney will file an emergency subpoena before your lunch break. We will launch a comprehensive audit into your facility. We will publicly litigate your compliance with federal patient privacy laws. We will drag every physician who authorized my hormone protocols onto a witness stand to explain why they allowed a third-party, non-medical relative to dictate the concealment of diagnostic records." Brenda stared at the gold lettering on the card. The threat of a ruined reputation and a federal compliance audit dismantled her resistance. The rigid institutional loyalty evaporated, replaced by raw professional self-preservation. She swallowed hard, pushing her chair back from the desk. She did not say another word. She stood up, retrieved a ring of brass keys from her blazer pocket, and walked toward the locked filing room. I waited, counting the seconds. The hum of the clinic around me faded into a dull static. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, Brenda emerged, holding a thick, worn manila envelope. The edges were frayed, indicating the passage of time. She placed it on the counter, sliding it toward me with a trembling hand. I took the envelope. I did not thank her. I turned around and walked out of the administrative suite, moving blindly until I found a quiet, sterile hallway near the secondary elevators. The corridor was empty, bathed in the relentless white glare of overhead light panels. I leaned against the cool, painted drywall. I untwisted the red string securing the flap of the envelope. I pulled out a stack of medical charts, diagnostic imaging printouts, and laboratory blood panels. I bypassed the recent documents, digging deep into the bottom of the stack to locate the records dated 7 years in the past. I found the initial intake assessment, 2 pages stapled together. 1 page bore my name. The second page bore the name of my husband. I read my own laboratory results first. The medical terminology required no translation. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and perfectly aligned within optimal parameters. Ovarian reserve, excellent. Endometrial lining, optimal. Hormone baseline, flawless. The paper trembled in my hands. The world around me stopped spinning. The air evacuated from my lungs. For 7 years, I absorbed the crushing guilt of a barren wife. I subjected myself to agonizing daily injections that left my skin mottled and bruised. I underwent invasive surgical egg retrievals, trusting the somber expressions of the medical staff. I spent countless nights lying awake doing mental calculations, trying to figure out what I did wrong. I blamed my diet. I blamed my stress levels. I blamed the occasional glass of wine I drank before realizing we were trying to conceive. I carried a private, devastating shame. Julian held my hand during those long, dark nights, playing the role of the devoted savior, tolerating a broken woman. The document in my hand explicitly proved my body was never broken. The foundation of my trauma was built on a deliberate, calculated forgery. I was a perfectly healthy woman, systematically gaslit into believing I was defective. Evelyn intercepted the truth and buried it to protect the immaculate image of her bloodline. She allowed me to endure physical and psychological torture rather than let her son face a diagnosis of failure. She treated me as a disposable incubator, willing to poison my system with unnecessary synthetic hormones to shield Julian from a bruised ego. A cold, terrifying clarity crystallized in my mind. If my reproductive metrics were flawless, then the barrier to our conception resided on the second page of the stapled document. I turned my attention to the paper bearing my husband's name. I scanned the rigid columns of text moving past the standard blood panels down to the specific fertility diagnostics. My eyes locked onto a single, bolded word near the bottom margin. The word that brought me to this hallway. The word that Evelyn read 7 years ago and decided to hide inside a locked filing room. I stared at the diagnosis, tracing the ink with my eyes. The medical truth unraveled the final thread of my reality. If this document was accurate, if the diagnosis printed beneath Julian's name was absolute and irreversible, then the sprawling architecture of his deception contained a fatal structural flaw. I looked up from the paper, staring down the empty fluorescent corridor. My pulse began to hammer a heavy, relentless rhythm against my ribs. A new, impossible calculation formed in my mind. Julian was currently driving across the Texas desert to provide for a secret family. He was sacrificing his financial future to raise 2 infants he believed were his legacy. But the paper in my hand dictated a mathematical impossibility. I needed to read the exact parameters of his failure. Because if Julian could not create life, then the twins sleeping in the West Texas townhouse belonged to someone else. The rented sedan felt like an industrial oven. I parked on the uppermost level of the concrete parking garage. The Houston sun beat down through the windshield, baking the slate leather interior. I kept the ignition off. The stifling air wrapped around my shoulders like a heavy woolen blanket, but a deep, icy chill radiated outward from my ribs. I stared at the second page of the medical file resting against the steering wheel. The bold black letters spelled out a physiological impossibility. Julian Alexander possessed a rare chromosomal deletion. The clinical jargon filled the paragraphs below his name, outlining a condition known as non-obstructive azospermia. The text detailed a catastrophic failure of spermatogenesis. The diagnostic conclusion offered no room for interpretation or false hope. His count registered at 0. The attending physician noted the anomaly was genetic, congenital, and permanent. No surgery could repair the defect. No hormonal therapy could reverse the barren landscape of his biology. He was a dead end. I ran my index finger over the printed diagnosis. The ink felt dry and permanent against my skin. The actuary inside my brain isolated the data points and fed them into a cold, logical equation. I spent the morning absorbing the shock of my own flawless health. My reproductive metrics were optimal, ready to sustain life. I spent the afternoon processing the cruelty of a mother who hid her son's genetic failure to preserve a pristine family crest. Evelyn watched me inject synthetic hormones into my stomach to fix a problem that originated inside her own lineage. She chose my physical torment over his bruised ego. But the most devastating calculation was just taking shape, forming a jagged edge in my mind. I closed my eyes. The image of the misrouted photograph flashed across the darkness of my eyelids. Julian, sitting in a vinyl hospital chair, wearing a blue button-down shirt, holding 2 newborn infants swaddled in striped blankets. I remembered the fierce, unguarded devotion etched across his face. I remembered the digital caption declaring his boundless love for his daughters. I remembered the tender kiss he planted on my sister's forehead in the sunlit driveway of a West Texas townhouse. The numbers did not add up. If Julian could not produce life if his biological ledger contained an unalterable 0, then the twins sleeping in the desert fortress could not carry his DNA. My eyes snapped open. The oppressive heat of the car vanished, replaced by a rushing, roaring clarity. Julian was not the mastermind of a brilliant double life. He was the unwitting mark of an elaborate, predatory scam. I shifted my analytical focus to Harper. My younger sister always navigated life looking for a safety net to catch her predictable falls. She flitted between temporary graphic design jobs, relying on my corporate income to cover her overdue rent and maxed-out credit cards. She despised rigid responsibility. 9 months ago, she claimed to land a lucrative remote contract that required her to relocate. She vanished into the periphery of our lives, surfacing only for occasional phone calls and vague text messages. Now the true nature of her remote contract revealed itself. Harper found herself pregnant by an unknown variable, perhaps a fleeting encounter in a downtown bar, perhaps a volatile ex-boyfriend who fled at the sight of a positive test. She faced the terrifying prospect of raising 2 infants without a reliable income or a stable partner. She needed a provider. She needed a man desperate enough for a child to ignore the glaring logistical inconsistencies of a sudden pregnancy. She targeted my husband. Julian carried a deep, unacknowledged insecurity regarding our childlessness. He played the stoic martyr for my benefit, but he craved the validation of a legacy. He wanted to be a patriarch. Harper weaponized our shared grief. She exploited his vulnerability, offering him the one prize he believed I could never provide. She secured a wealthy, desperate sponsor for another man's children. The sheer audacity of the deception took my breath away. The betrayers had unknowingly betrayed each other. Julian bankrupted his independent retirement accounts and signed predatory high-interest loans to build a sanctuary for a grifter. Harper manipulated a man into claiming paternity for infants that shared no blood with him, binding him to a lifetime of financial obligation. They constructed a second family on the exact same fraudulent foundation as my marriage, a house built on lies sinking into the sand. I reached toward the center console and turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life, and the air conditioning blasted a stream of frigid air against my face. The physical sensation grounded me, snapping the remaining pieces of my strategy into place. 2 days ago, my objective was straightforward. I intended to hand Marcus Vance the financial documentation and serve Julian with a zero-notice divorce petition. I wanted to lock him out of our shared estate and leave him drowning in the shadow debt he created. I wanted to disappear from his life with my assets intact, leaving him to navigate the wreckage of his infidelity alone. That exit strategy felt grossly insufficient now. A standard legal separation provides a clean break. A clean break allows the guilty parties to recover to narrate their own version of the fallout. Julian would tell his corporate colleagues we drifted apart due to the unbearable strain of infertility. Evelyn would host her charity galas, whispering to her socialite friends that my inability to conceive broke her son's heart. Harper would play the role of the devoted mother, supported by a man who stepped up when her own sister walked away. I refused to let them control the narrative. I refused to let the ledger remain unbalanced. I placed the medical file back into the manila envelope and secured the red string. I tossed the folder onto the passenger seat. The document represented the ultimate override code. It was the key to a controlled, systemic demolition. I needed to engineer a scenario where the entire ecosystem of lies collapsed simultaneously in the same room. I could not simply inform Julian of his sterility. He might hide the truth from Harper, attempting to maintain the illusion of his fatherhood. I could not confront Harper alone. She would manufacture another lie, weaving a new web of deceit to keep her provider on the hook. I could not face Evelyn in private. She would deny everything, utilizing her vast wealth and social influence to bury the clinic file a second time. They needed to face the void together. They needed to witness the destruction of their individual realities in real time, unable to hide behind their carefully constructed masks. I checked the rearview mirror backing out of the concrete parking space. I navigated the spiraling exit ramps of the medical pavilion, emerging into the glaring Houston daylight. I mapped the route back to Dallas in my mind. Julian was currently trapped in a holding pattern. The financial freeze orchestrated by my legal team rendered his credit cards useless and his bank accounts empty. He would spend the next 48 hours scrambling to understand why his liquidity vanished, assuming a bank error or an identity theft protocol triggered the lockdown. He would return to our suburban home, desperate to maintain his corporate facade while he sorted out the fiscal mess. Harper would remain in the West Texas townhouse, waiting for her sponsor to return with the cash he promised. Evelyn would sit in her Highland Park estate, trembling with the knowledge that the divorce proceedings might unearth her buried secret. I merged onto the interstate, pressing the accelerator down. I needed to issue an invitation. I needed to gather the architects of my misery around a single table under the guise of a celebration. I would play the role of the oblivious wife one last time, setting a pristine stage for the final act. I would offer them a feast and serve them the truth. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming message. The notification preview showed a text from Harper. The timing of her digital intrusion felt almost poetic. I kept my eyes on the highway, letting the device buzz against the plastic console. The trap was forming, taking shape in the space between the lane markers. The audit was complete. It was time to initiate the liquidation. I pulled the sedan into a desolate rest stop somewhere off Interstate 45. The heat radiating from the asphalt warped the horizon into a shimmering mirage. I shifted the vehicle into park and finally retrieved my phone from the center console. The screen glowed with an unread notification from Harper. I opened the message. The image loaded, displaying a bright, sunlit living room I recognized immediately. The West Texas townhouse. Harper sat on a plush, cream-colored sofa, holding the two infants against her chest. She wore a pristine white linen shirt, her blonde hair cascading in deliberate, messy waves over her shoulders. She looked the picture of exhausted, radiant motherhood. Below the photograph, a line of text waited. Babysitting for a desperate neighbor today. Exhausting. I stared at the glowing pixels. The psychological geometry of her message was breathtaking in its cruelty. Harper did not send this image by accident. She engineered it. She wanted to flaunt the infants she secured through deception right in front of the sister who spent 7 years failing to produce a single heartbeat. It was a fishing expedition designed to elicit a reaction of sorrow or jealousy, a subtle assertion of dominance from a woman hiding in plain sight. She wanted me to look at the children my husband believed were his legacy and feel the sharp sting of my own inadequacy. The dramatic irony settled over me like a heavy protective armor. Harper sat on that cream sofa believing she held the ultimate leverage. She thought she trapped a wealthy provider by leveraging his biological desperation. She had no concept that the man funding her desert sanctuary possessed a genetic void. She was running a long con on a Mark who possessed zero biological currency. I did not block her number. I did not unleash a paragraph of righteous fury. Revealing any emotional disturbance would compromise my operational advantage. I tapped the keyboard, delivering a response calibrated to project absolute oblivious compliance. Cute. 4 letters, a single keystroke to send. I locked the screen and placed the device back into the console. The bait was taken. She would read that reply and feel a surge of unearned victory, confident her smokescreen remained impenetrable. I merged back onto the highway, formulating the parameters of the impending convergence. A standard confrontation isolates the variables. I needed a synchronized collapse. By the time I navigated the familiar winding streets of my Dallas suburb, the architecture of the trap was fully designed. I parked in the driveway and stepped into the quiet foyer of my home. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of an empty nest. It was the calculated stillness of a staging area. My phone rang before I could drop my keys on the entryway table. The caller identification displayed Julian. Nova, he said, his voice clipped tight with a suppressed panic he tried desperately to mask. Did you authorize a fraud alert on our checking accounts? Every card I possess just declined at a gas station outside Waco. The bank automated system claims a legal hold is in place. He was reeling. The sudden evaporation of his purchasing power left him stranded and terrified. He needed to project the image of a concerned husband dealing with a banking error, rather than a man whose shadow life just lost its funding. I kept my tone light and breezy, injecting a note of mild confusion into my response. A legal hold. That sounds like a system glitch, Julian. I can call the wealth management branch in the morning to sort it out. Are you all right? Do you need me to wire funds to a different account? I offered the wire transfer, knowing the algorithms already blocked any outgoing capital. The illusion of my helpfulness calmed his erratic breathing. No, I can manage, he replied, swallowing hard. I have a corporate card for the fuel. Just fix it tomorrow. I will handle the bank, I promised, walking into the kitchen and running my fingers over the cold granite island. But we have a much larger agenda to discuss when you return. The firm called me into the executive boardroom this afternoon. They are promoting me to Chief Risk Officer. It is official. The lie flowed with effortless precision. A promotion of that magnitude translated to a significant expansion of our household income. For a man currently drowning in high-interest loans, the prospect of a massive influx of capital acted as a potent anesthetic. He needed my wealth now more than ever to sustain his desert operation. Nova, that is incredible, he breathed, the relief palpable through the cellular connection. I am so proud of you. We need to celebrate, I continued, dictating the terms of his surrender. I am hosting a formal dinner here on Saturday night. I want you home. And I want to invite Harper and your mother. It feels like the right moment to bring everyone together. Julian hesitated. The logistical strain of managing his mistress and his wife in the same room usually deterred him. But the promise of my new executive salary overrode his caution. He agreed, promising to finish his fictitious compliance seminar and return by Friday evening. Securing Evelyn required a different calibration. I dialed her Highland Park number. She answered on the first ring, her breathing shallow, anticipating the fallout of her earlier emotional fracture. Evelyn, I began pitching my voice to convey a soothing, conciliatory warmth. I want to apologize for the banking alert you received earlier today. It was a security measure triggered by a compromised data server at the firm. Everything is perfectly fine. A long, trembling exhale traveled across the line. She desperately wanted to believe the threat of exposure had vanished. She wanted the 7-year-old secret to remain locked in the Houston archive. In fact, everything is more than fine, I added. I am stepping into the Chief Risk Officer role on Monday. I am hosting an intimate dinner on Saturday to commemorate the milestone. Julian will be here. I would be honored if you joined us. I think it is time we moved forward, put the past where it belongs. The subtle promise hidden in my words offered her the exact absolution she craved. She accepted the invitation, her voice regaining a fraction of its usual aristocratic polish. Harper required the least effort. I called her, proposing a free flight from Midland and a night at a luxury hotel downtown in exchange for her attendance at my celebration. Greed and the desire to monitor her oblivious mark secured her immediate confirmation. The trap was set. The invitations were accepted. The 3 architects of my suffering were charting a direct course for my dining room. Saturday afternoon arrived carrying the heavy, stagnant heat characteristic of a Texas summer. I stood alone in the center of the formal dining space. The room featured deep charcoal walls, a long mahogany table, and a modern linear chandelier casting a warm, deliberate glow over the surface. The pacing of the day slowed to a crawl. Every minute stretched, building an agonizing physical anticipation in my chest. I prepared the environment not for a meal, but for an execution. I retrieved my finest table linens, pressing the heavy white fabric until crisp, flawless creases formed along the edges. I laid the runner down the center of the wood, ensuring the geometry was exact. I pulled the crystal wine glasses from the high cabinet, polishing each stem with a microfiber cloth until the glass vanished into perfect transparency. The tactile repetition of setting the table grounded my focus. I placed a silver charger at the head of the table where I would sit. I arranged the remaining 3 settings in close proximity, forcing my guests to share an uncomfortable physical intimacy. Julian would sit to my right, Harper would sit directly across from him, Evelyn would sit at the opposite end, anchoring the triangle of deception. The dramatic irony hung thick in the air, wrapping around the polished silverware and the folded linen napkins. The listener, looking through the window of this quiet suburban house, knows exactly what waits inside the leather briefcase resting by the credenza. The unredacted medical report, the GPS coordinates of the desert townhouse, the printed loan origination documents. Julian was upstairs showering, washing the scent of the highway off his skin, preparing to play the role of the proud husband. He believed he was walking downstairs to secure his financial lifeline. Harper was currently in a taxi, riding from her luxury hotel, anticipating a night of subtle mockery and free champagne. Evelyn was sitting in the back of a black car, rehearsing her socialite smile, believing her dark medical forgery remained buried in the past. They were adjusting their masks, checking their reflections in the mirror, entirely oblivious to the fact that the floorboards beneath their feet were rigged to collapse. I placed the final water glass near Evelyn's designated plate, aligning it perfectly with the tip of the silver knife. The stage was pristine. The lighting was calibrated. I smoothed the front of my dark tailored dress and listened to the sound of tires rolling into the driveway. The slaughterhouse was open for business. The doorbell chimed at precisely 7 o'clock. Evelyn stood on the front porch, enveloped in the humid evening air. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a strand of authentic pearls armor designed for high society engagements. She held a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, offering the dark glass as a silent truce. I accepted the wine, noting the slight tremor in her manicured fingers. She stepped into the foyer, desperate to believe the fiction I spun over the phone. She needed this dinner to represent a clean slate, a guarantee that her 7-year-old medical forgery would remain buried under the guise of my corporate promotion. Harper arrived 15 minutes later. A rideshare vehicle idled at the curb while she sauntered up the concrete walkway. She wore a sleek, asymmetrical black jumpsuit, projecting the aesthetic of a thriving creative professional. The scent of her expensive floral perfume preceded her, a fragrance purchased with the shadow debt my husband accumulated. She hugged me at the door, a brief, hollow embrace. Her eyes scanned the interior of my home, cataloging the luxury she intended to inherit. She smiled, a bright, sharp expression, carrying the quiet arrogance of a woman who believed she already won the war. Julian descended the central staircase. He wore a crisp, navy button-down shirt, his hair damp from a recent shower. The water did not wash away the visible tension tight along his jawline. His financial reality was currently bleeding out. His credit cards remained frozen, his accounts zeroed out. He was a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to pull. He kissed my cheek, greeting his mother and my sister with practiced, effortless charm. He handed Harper a glass of sparkling water, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A micro-interaction. I logged the data point. I guided them into the formal dining room. The space felt compressed, the dark walls absorbing the ambient light. The linear chandelier illuminated the polished mahogany table and the pristine white linen runner. I directed them to their assigned seats. Julian took the chair to my right. Harper sat directly across from him. Evelyn anchored the far end, forming a perfect physical triangle of deception. I sat at the head of the table, the apex of the structure. I served the first course, braised short ribs resting over wild mushroom risotto. The rich, savory aroma filled the room, contrasting with the suffocating psychological pressure pressing against the walls. The physical act of chewing provided a necessary baseline rhythm. The metallic scrape of silver forks against porcelain plates echoed in the strained quiet. We engaged in a hollow pantomime of domestic normalcy. Evelyn praised the culinary presentation, desperate to keep the conversation floating on a shallow surface. Harper offered a veiled toast, raising her crystal glass to commend my ability to focus on corporate climbing while neglecting real life. A calculated insult designed to remind Julian of my barren status. Julian drank his wine too fast. The crimson liquid stained his lips. He checked his phone, resting near his water glass, hoping for a notification from the bank that his funds were restored. The screen remained dark. He needed an exit strategy. He needed to control the narrative before his fiscal collapse became public knowledge. He assumed my impending executive salary offered a safety net, but the immediate logistical nightmare of funding the desert townhouse required decisive action. He misread my calm demeanor. He interpreted my quiet composure as submission. He placed his fork down. The silver utensil clattered sharply against the edge of the china plate. The sudden noise silenced the room. Evelyn looked up, her eyes darting between us. Harper leaned back in her upholstered chair, observing her sponsor. Julian exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He reached across the smooth mahogany surface and placed his hand over mine. His skin felt clammy. He arranged his facial features into a mask of profound, fabricated sorrow. He looked into my eyes, deploying the performance he rehearsed during his drive back from Austin. Nova, he began, his voice thick with manufactured grief. I did not want to do this tonight, not when you have worked so hard for this promotion. But sitting here, pretending everything is fine, is destroying me. I did not pull my hand away. I did not blink. I waited for the lie to take its full shape. We have spent 7 years fighting a ghost, he continued, his tone dropping into a practiced, mournful whisper. We chased doctors and endured treatments, and we lost pieces of ourselves along the way. The unbearable trauma of our infertility has broken something fundamental between us. We are living in a house filled with empty bedrooms. I have watched you suffer, and it has torn my heart apart to see you carry that guilt. He paused, letting the heavy emotional weight of his words settle over the table. He positioned himself as the tragic, long-suffering hero, the devoted partner breaking under the impossible strain of a tragedy he could no longer shoulder. I love you, he said, his voice cracking with theatrical precision. But this grief has driven us too far apart. I think we need a separation, a formal break. We need space to heal before we destroy whatever respect we have left. The word separation hung in the air, a toxic cloud suspended over the risotto. Evelyn dropped her linen napkin onto her lap. Her complexion turned a sickly shade of gray. A separation meant legal scrutiny. Legal scrutiny meant medical disclosures. Her carefully maintained social armor began to crack. Harper shifted her weight, crossing her legs under the table. Her eyes widened slightly. She wanted Julian to leave me, but executing the breakup in the middle of a dinner party deviated from her script. She liked to control the variables. She watched me, waiting for the inevitable hysterical breakdown. She expected tears. She expected me to beg the only provider I knew to stay. I offered nothing. I did not cry. I did not argue. I maintained absolute, unbroken eye contact with the man holding my hand. I smoothly slid my hand out from under his grasp. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. The brass clasps of my leather briefcase snapped open a sharp mechanical click that cut through the heavy silence. I pulled out a thick, bound stack of legal documents. The paper felt heavy, substantial, and definitive. I lifted the dossier and placed it on the table. With a single fluid motion, I slid the stack across the polished mahogany. The document hissed against the wood, coming to a precise stop inches from his water glass. Julian stared at the dense packet of paper. The manufactured sorrow on his face faltered, replaced by genuine, stark confusion. He looked down at the cover page. The bold black font spelled out a reality he never anticipated. Petition for dissolution of marriage. This was not a mutual request for space. This was a unilateral, legal execution. He scanned the subsequent lines. The documents detailed emergency financial injunctions, asset freezes, and allegations of severe fiscal fraud. The predatory legal architecture outlined in the pages stripped him of every defense. He looked up from the paper. The power dynamic in the room inverted in a single, silent breath. He was no longer the tragic hero orchestrating a gentle departure. He was a target stepping onto a landmine. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The strings controlling his performance were severed. I leaned back in my chair, watching his reality fracture, preparing to drag the rest of his secrets out of the dark. Julian stared at the dense packet of paper resting inches from his crystal water glass. His eyes tracked the bold black font of the cover page. His jaw slacked. The calculated mask of the tragic hero melted away, leaving the raw, terrified expression of a man realizing the floorboards beneath his feet had vanished. He reached out with a trembling hand, flipping the first page. The legal jargon stared back at him, outlining the financial injunctions, the asset freezes, the allegations of severe fiscal fraud. His breathing turned shallow. The quiet hum of the air conditioning unit amplified, filling the suffocating silence of the dining room. Harper watched him unravel. She possessed an instinct for self-preservation, cultivated over years of relying on other people to fix her mistakes. She sensed the power dynamic shifting in a direction she could not control. She needed to reassert her position as the sympathetic anchor to ensure her provider did not collapse. She leaned across the polished mahogany table, extending her arm toward me. Her manicured fingers reached for my wrist. "Nova, honey," she whispered, pitching her voice into a gentle, coaxing register. "What is this? Are you having a breakdown?" I brought my arm down in a swift arc. The back of my hand struck her wrist with a sharp, stinging crack. The physical contact echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice did not rise above a conversational volume, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Harper yanked her hand back, cradling her wrist against her chest. Her eyes widened, shedding the faux concern, replaced by genuine alarm. I did not look at her. I kept my gaze locked on Julian. He finally looked up from the divorce petition. His corporate polish evaporated. He looked like a cornered animal, searching the perimeter for an exit that did not exist. "You thought the banking alert was a system glitch?" I stated, leaning back in my chair, resting my hands in my lap. "You thought the algorithms made a routine error. There is no error, Julian. Every shared credit card is deactivated. The joint accounts are zeroed out. The wealth management portfolio is legally inaccessible to you pending a judicial review for dissipation of marital assets." He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. "Nova, you do not understand," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "I understand mathematics." I interrupted, cutting off his excuse before it could form. "I understand that a mid-tier logistics director cannot sustain a parallel existence without leaving a paper trail. You avoided our joint ledgers because you knew I audited them. You thought you were clever hiding in the margins, but draining your independent retirement portfolio and signing high-yield predatory personal loans at exorbitant interest rates leaves a blinding digital footprint. You leveraged your entire future to the brink of insolvency to fund a lie." Julian gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned stark white. Harper shrank back into her upholstered chair, the sleek black fabric of her jumpsuit blending into the shadows. The realization dawned on her that the wealthy provider she manipulated was currently sitting at my table, bankrupt and legally paralyzed. Her desert sanctuary was no longer funded. "And you, Harper?" I continued, turning my head to face my younger sister. "You always despised the heat. You preferred the downtown lofts, the proximity to coffee shops, the curated urban aesthetic. Moving to an isolated oil town required a very specific incentive." Harper opened her mouth, but her throat tightened. She managed a weak, dismissive scoff, trying to project an air of superiority. "I do not know what you are talking about." "The emerald silk wrap dress you requested for a baby shower?" I replied, delivering the data point with the precision of a surgical scalpel. "I sewed a micro GPS tracking device into the inner lining before I shipped it to you. The device pinged upon delivery. It transmitted a steady geographic signal straight to my phone. I know the exact address of the luxury stucco townhouse in Midland. I drove there. I parked a rented sedan under an oak tree. I sat in the shadows and watched you carry those infant carriers out of his silver SUV. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. The elaborate smokescreen they spent 9 months constructing evaporated, leaving them exposed under the harsh, linear light of my dining room chandelier. The affair was no longer a suspicion or a whispered rumor. It was a documented, audited reality, resting on the mahogany table alongside the cooling, braised short ribs. Julian looked at Harper, then back at me. The panic in his chest mutated. The terrified husband vanished, replaced by a man fighting for his perceived survival. When a narcissist is stripped of their deception, they do not apologize. They justify. They rewrite the narrative to frame themselves as the victim of an impossible circumstance. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, towering over the table. His chest heaved. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his crisp navy shirt. The cornered animal bared its teeth. "You want to talk about reality?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the dark charcoal walls. "Let us talk about reality, Nova. For 7 years, I lived in a graveyard. This house is a tomb. I spent 7 years holding your hand while you cried over negative tests. I watched you inject yourself with chemicals. I spent thousands of dollars on doctors who told us your body was failing." He pointed an accusing finger at me, weaponizing the trauma he helped manufacture. He used my darkest hours as a shield for his betrayal. "I endured it," he spat, leaning over the table. "I played the good husband. I swallowed my own grief because you were too fragile to handle yours. But I am a man, Nova. I have a biological right to be a father. I have a right to a legacy. You could not give me that. You could not give me a family. I refuse to let my bloodline die in this sterile, empty house." Harper watched him, her eyes darting between us. She saw her meal ticket, defending his choices, wrapping himself in the delusion of his own virility. He was claiming the children as his ultimate justification. Julian reached into the pocket of his slacks. His hand shook as he retrieved his smartphone. He unlocked the screen, tapping furiously until the display illuminated with a bright, high-resolution image. He held the device up like a trophy. The screen displayed the photograph that started the audit. The twins, swaddled in pink and blue hospital blankets, sleeping soundly in his arms. "Look at them," he demanded, his voice cracking with a desperate, twisted pride. "Look at what I created. They are mine. They are my future. I did what I had to do to secure my own blood. I gave them life." He turned away from me, pivoting toward the far end of the table. Evelyn sat frozen in her chair. She had remained entirely silent during the unraveling, gripping her linen napkin with white-knuckled intensity. The socialite armor she wore was cracking, fracturing under the immense weight of the confrontation. Julian thrust the glowing phone toward her face, demanding validation, demanding that his mother endorse his betrayal and praise his virility. "Tell her, Mom," he yelled, the sound bouncing off the crystal wine glasses. "Tell her a man deserves his own children. Tell her I made the right choice to protect our family name. Look at your granddaughters. Look at my blood." Evelyn did not speak. She slowly raised her head. Her perfectly coiffed hair caught the light of the chandelier. She looked at the illuminated screen of the smartphone hovering inches from her face. She stared at the tiny faces of the newborn infants sleeping peacefully in their hospital blankets. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The color drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her complexion the color of ash. Her eyes widened, taking on a hollow, haunted quality. The authentic pearls around her neck rattled as a visible tremor racked her shoulders. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff who just realized the ground beneath her heels was made of sand. She knew the math. She knew the unforgiving, permanent reality locked inside a Houston filing cabinet. Julian was screaming about his bloodline, his biological right, his legacy. He was demanding she validate a future that her hidden medical document proved was a literal, physiological impossibility. Evelyn shifted her gaze from the glowing screen to my face. The frantic, desperate plea in her eyes begged me to keep the trap door closed. She realized I did not invite her here to celebrate a corporate promotion. I invited her here to witness the collapse of the false kingdom she helped build. The ledger was open, the deficit was glaring, and the man holding the phone was seconds away from learning that the children he destroyed his life to finance belonged to a ghost. The glowing screen of the smartphone hovered in the space between Julian and his mother. The high-resolution photograph of the sleeping infants illuminated the sharp contours of Evelyn's terrified face. The dining room fell into a suffocating stillness. The hum of the central air conditioning unit faded into the background, overshadowed by the ragged, uneven cadence of her breathing. Julian stood towering over the polished mahogany, demanding validation for a legacy that existed only in his fractured mind. He held the digital proof of his virility like a weapon, waiting for the matriarch of the family to bless his betrayal. Evelyn did not offer a blessing. She lowered her gaze from the bright screen to the thick stack of legal documents resting near his water glass. The cover page of the divorce petition stared back at her. Her mind connected the variables. She understood the true nature of this dinner party. I did not invite her to celebrate a corporate promotion. I summoned her to finalize an audit. She realized I possessed the unredacted medical file from the Houston clinic. I held the structural blueprint of her deception, and I had just dropped the detonator onto the table. Her manicured hands trembled so severely, the silver cutlery near her plate rattled against the china. She looked up at me. The pristine socialite armor she wore for decades cracked, shattering into jagged, useless pieces. A silent plea passed between us across the cooling, braised short ribs. She begged me with her eyes to keep the vault locked. I offered a shallow, empty smile. I picked up my crystal wine glass and brought the rim to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage Bordeaux. The liquid tasted of dark cherry and bitter oak. I did not say a word. I surrendered the floor to the architect of the original lie. Evelyn turned her head back toward her son. The color drained entirely from her skin, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. Her throat worked, swallowing against a rising tide of panic. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely a fraction of its normal aristocratic volume. "She did not tell you." Julian blinked. The righteous fury fueling his performance faltered, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. He lowered the smartphone, the screen casting a faint blue light against the dark fabric of his navy shirt. He looked at the divorce petition, then back at his trembling mother. "Tell me what he demanded," his tone shedding the theatrical grief. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Evelyn gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned stark white, resembling polished ivory. She squeezed her eyes shut as if blocking out the visual reality of the room could somehow alter the impending destruction. "The clinic in Houston," she began, her words catching in her throat. 7 years ago, during the initial intake procedures." Julian frowned. The mention of the fertility clinic introduced a variable he did not expect. He assumed this confrontation centered entirely on his financial infidelity and his hidden life in the desert. He failed to comprehend how a 7-year-old medical appointment factored into his current crisis. "What about Houston?" he asked, his voice hardening, returning to a defensive posture. "Nova was failing. Her body was rejecting the treatments. We spent thousands of dollars trying to fix her." Evelyn opened her eyes. Tears breached the rim of her lower lashes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup, tracing dark lines down her pale cheeks. It was not Nova, she confessed, the admission tearing out of her chest. The dining room descended into a profound, chilling vacuum. The air felt too thick to pull into my lungs. Julian froze. The muscles in his jaw locked. He stared at the woman who spent his entire life curating a perfect, flawless image of their family lineage. "They sent a letter to the house," Evelyn continued, her voice breaking, splintering under the weight of the truth. "You were out of town on business. The envelope bore the insignia of the Fertility Institute. I opened it. I thought it contained a routine billing statement. I read the diagnostic summary." Julian leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the mahogany surface. His breathing turned shallow, rapid. "You read what?" "I read your laboratory results," she sobbed, the pristine facade dissolving into raw, ugly terror. The attending physician outlined a genetic anomaly. Non-obstructive azospermia. He noted a catastrophic failure of spermatogenesis. Julian shook his head, a rigid, mechanical movement. His brain rejected the incoming data. Cognitive dissonance erected a frantic barrier against the impossible information. He pointed a finger at her, his hand shaking. "Stop talking," he ordered. You do not know what you are saying. You are confused." "I am not confused, Julian," she cried, reaching across the table, her fingers grasping empty air. The diagnosis was definitive. The report explicitly stated, "You carry a congenital defect. Your count registered at 0. The condition is permanent, irreversible. You are sterile." The word dropped onto the dining table, heavy and undeniable. Sterile. The mathematical certainty of the medical term paralyzed the room. The silence that followed was deafening, carrying the sheer force of a physical blow. Julian stood frozen, a statue carved out of denial. He spent the last 7 years acting as the patient's savior, tolerating a broken wife. He spent the last 9 months draining his corporate retirement accounts, signing predatory, high-interest personal loans, and burning his fiscal future to the ground to build a sanctuary for his legacy. He looked down at his right hand. His fingers remained wrapped around the edges of his smartphone. The display had faded to black, entering sleep mode. The photograph of the newborn twins vanished, leaving only his own distorted reflection staring back from the dark glass. If his sterility was absolute, if the clinical diagnosis mailed to his childhood home 7 years ago dictated a permanent biological void, then the infants swaddled in the hospital blankets did not carry his DNA. The actuary inside my mind watched the equation balance. The final variable snapped into place, locking the structure into a permanent, unalterable reality. Julian slowly rotated his head. The movement appeared agonizing, stiff, with a dawning, horrifying comprehension. He turned his gaze away from the weeping matriarch and focused on the woman sitting directly across the table. Harper did not deliver a villainous monologue. She did not attempt to spin a new web of deceit or deploy a fabricated excuse. The predator recognized she was cornered. Her carefully constructed sympathetic facade dropped instantly. The smug arrogance she carried into my home evaporated, replaced by sheer, wide-eyed terror. Her face drained of all color, mirroring the ashen pallor of Evelyn. She pressed her spine hard against the back of the upholstered chair, shrinking away from the impending blast radius. Her manicured hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. She offered nothing but silence, and her silence served as the ultimate, irrefutable confession. She always knew the twins belonged to another man. A fleeting encounter, a volatile ex-partner who disappeared at the site of a positive pregnancy test. She found herself facing the terrifying prospect of raising 2 infants without a reliable income or a stable foundation. She calculated the odds and targeted the most vulnerable mark in her proximity. She weaponized my childlessness, exploiting a man desperate for validation. She traded a fabricated paternity for a luxury desert townhouse funded by stolen equity. Julian stared at my younger sister. The realization crashed over him, dismantling his identity piece by painful piece. He was not a virile patriarch securing his bloodline against an unfair fate. He was the unwitting mark of a predatory grifter. He bankrupted his life, decimated his marriage, and destroyed his financial future to sponsor a stranger's children. He was the gullible idiot he mocked just days prior. The ledger was exposed under the harsh linear light of the chandelier. The numbers did not add up. The deficits were glaring, undeniable, and permanent. The house built on lies succumbed to gravity, sinking into the sand. I sat quietly at the apex of the table. I brought the crystal glass to my lips once more, letting the rich, dark wine coat my tongue. I watched the implosion, feeling no sorrow, no pity, and no lingering trace of anger. I observed the destruction with cold, clinical detachment. The audit concluded, the bankruptcy was official. The only remaining action required was to dictate the terms of the liquidation. The heavy silence settled over the dining room, pressing down on the 4 of us like a physical weight. The ambient temperature seemed to drop, freezing the remaining warmth from the braised short ribs resting untouched on the porcelain plates. Harper remained pressed against the back of her upholstered chair. The sleek, asymmetrical black jumpsuit she chose for an evening of subtle victory now served as mourning attire for her incinerated leverage. Julian did not blink. His eyes remained locked on my younger sister, searching her terrified face for a contradiction that would never materialize. The illusion of his virility lay shattered on the mahogany table alongside the clinical forgery his mother engineered. He waited for Harper to unleash a defensive tirade. He expected her to hurl accusations at Evelyn or demand a secondary medical evaluation. He needed her to fight for the narrative they constructed together. She offered nothing but a wide-eyed, paralyzed stare. Her silence functioned as the final, definitive verdict. Harper built her entire adult existence on a foundation of calculated bailouts. When she wrecked a vehicle, she expected my insurance to cover the damages. When she neglected her downtown loft rent, she relied on my corporate salary to prevent the eviction. 9 months ago, she faced a crisis my checkbook could not solve. She encountered a transient variable, perhaps a charming bartender or a traveling musician, who vanished the moment a plastic stick displayed 2 pink lines. Facing the terrifying logistics of solitary motherhood without a steady income, she scanned her perimeter for a viable host. She identified Julian. She recognized the deep, agonizing insecurity he harbored regarding our barren household. She saw a man desperate to prove his biological worth, a man craving the title of patriarch. She did not target him out of sudden, uncontrollable passion. She orchestrated a calculated acquisition. She offered him the ultimate validation, wrapping a devastating lie in the soft pink and blue striped blankets of another man's children. Julian opened his mouth. His jaw worked, trying to form a coherent word through the shock paralyzing his vocal cords. "Whose are they?" he asked. The question did not emerge as a shout. It slipped past his lips as a hollow, broken rasp. Harper flinched as if struck by a physical blow. She parted her lips, attempting to construct a plausible fiction. A desperate grifter always searches for one last maneuver. But the absolute certainty of the Houston Clinic file extinguished any potential alternate theory. She could not claim a miracle. She could not feign ignorance. The stark, unyielding biology of non-obstructive azospermia left zero margin for negotiation. "I do not know," she whispered. The confession barely disturbed the air in the room, but it carried the destructive force of a seismic event. Julian recoiled, his broad shoulders slumped inward, his posture collapsing as the invisible scaffolding supporting his ego snapped. The man who sat holding my hand in sterile waiting rooms, playing the stoic martyr, vanished. The man who secretly leased a luxury stucco townhouse in the desert, pretending to secure his bloodline, ceased to exist. The reality of his situation crashed over him a tidal wave of financial and emotional ruin. He remembered the arrogant sneer he wore just days ago standing in our kitchen. He recalled swirling a glass of bourbon, passing harsh judgment on a corporate colleague deceived by a fraudulent paternity claim. What a gullible idiot, he had declared. The memory returned to him now, a bitter, agonizing echo. He was the gullible idiot. He was the mark. His breathing accelerated, losing its steady rhythm. Short, shallow gasps filled the quiet dining room. He clutched the edge of the polished table, his knuckles straining against the skin. He dragged his gaze away from Harper, looking down at the thick stack of legal documents resting near his water glass. The divorce petition outlined the exact dimensions of his fiscal destruction. He drained his independent retirement portfolio, incurring massive early withdrawal penalties and crippling tax liabilities. He signed a series of predatory personal loans, accepting exorbitant interest rates to ensure a continuous flow of untraceable cash. He leveraged his entire future to the absolute brink of insolvency. He committed severe financial fraud against his own marital estate. And he executed this comprehensive self-destruction to purchase baby formula cribs and a luxury lease for infants carrying the DNA of a nameless stranger. He owned nothing. He held zero equity. His credit cards were frozen, his bank accounts locked. He stood on the precipice of bankruptcy, chained to a staggering shadow debt, while facing an aggressive legal execution that would strip him of his primary home. He sacrificed his loyal wife, his corporate reputation, and his financial security to sponsor a grifter. The hyperventilation intensified. Julian pulled at the collar of his crisp navy shirt, the cotton fabric suddenly restricting his airway. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. A low, guttural sob tore its way out of his throat, a sound devoid of theatrical manipulation. It was the raw, unfiltered agony of a man recognizing the total annihilation of his universe. Evelyn watched her son break. The matriarch remained frozen in her chair, her pristine socialite armor lying in jagged ruins around her feet. She caused this. She intercepted the clinic letter 7 years ago, choosing to protect his fragile ego rather than tell him the truth. Her choice paved the exact path to his current destruction. If she handed him that document 7 years ago, he would have mourned his sterility, but he never would have fallen prey to a predatory pregnancy scam. Her desperate need to curate a flawless family image engineered the ultimate public scandal. I sat at the apex of the table, observing the carnage. As a risk actuary, I spend my professional life evaluating structural integrity. I assess the load-bearing capacity of corporate foundations, predicting exactly when a system will buckle under pressure. A structure built on fraudulent data will always eventually collapse. The timing is merely a matter of applied stress. I applied the stress. I gathered the corrupted variables into a single room and forced them to interact. The resulting demolition unfolded with perfect mathematical precision. I felt no desire to gloat. Gloating implies a lingering emotional investment, a need to twist the knife to secure a victory. I possess no victory to celebrate. I lost 7 years of my life to a clinical forgery. I endured physical torment and crushing psychological guilt for a defective biology that never existed. I did not win a prize today. I simply cleared a corrupted ledger. The devastation, speaking for itself, required no supplementary commentary. Harper sat paralyzed, trapped in a lie that just lost its funding. Evelyn sat mute, suffocating under the weight of her catastrophic maternal failure. Julian wept openly, his tears falling onto the polished mahogany surface, staining the wood. I lifted my crystal glass, taking another slow sip of the vintage Bordeaux. The rich oak flavor coated my tongue, contrasting sharply with the bitter reality choking the other occupants of the room. I set the glass down, ensuring the base aligned perfectly with the woven placemat. My movements remained fluid, measured, and calm. Julian dragged his hands down his face, his skin flushed and slick with sweat. He lifted his head, looking at me through red-rimmed, devastated eyes. The arrogance, the manipulative charm, the manufactured sorrow, they were entirely stripped away. He saw the cold clinical detachment in my posture. He realized I did not engineer this evening to win him back or to punish him into submission. I engineered this evening to finalize a transaction. Nova. He choked out my name, sounding like a plea for a lifeline he knew I would not extend. Please. The conflict shifted, transitioning from the revelation of the truth to the stark, unforgiving mechanics of the aftermath. He understood the lie was dead, but he had not yet grasped the absolute finality of my exit. He still believed a margin for negotiation existed. He still thought an apology could mitigate the fiscal guillotine waiting in the divorce petition. He was about to learn that closing an account leaves no room for bargaining. Please. The single syllable slipped from Julian's lips, hanging in the stagnant air of the dining room. The word sounded thin and pathetic, stripped of the polished corporate charm he wielded for 7 years. That charm served as a mask, a carefully constructed veneer hiding a fragile, desperate insecurity. Now the veneer lay in shards across the mahogany table. The insecurity was all that remained, raw and exposed under the bright linear lighting of the chandelier. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching my face for a lifeline. He wanted the safety net back. He wanted the reliable actuary to step in, run the numbers, and fix his broken ledger. He wanted me to absorb this disaster, just as I absorbed the countless negative pregnancy tests and the agonizing fertility treatments. I did not know, he stammered, his voice cracking into a jagged whisper. Nova, you have to believe me. I thought they were mine. She tricked me. She played me for a fool. He lifted a trembling hand, pointing a rigid finger across the table toward my younger sister. He attempted to pivot, to paint himself as the tragic victim of a predatory scheme. He needed me to align with him against Harper, to view him as a casualty rather than an architect of this devastation. He traded a woman who injected her own stomach with synthetic chemicals, who sat in sterile waiting rooms, who offered him unyielding loyalty, for a grifter who manipulated his deepest vulnerability. He threw away his corporate respectability, his marriage, and his financial stability for a mirage wrapped in hospital blankets. The profound humiliation of that transaction coated his throat, choking his words. I did this for a legacy. He choked out, tears spilling over his lower lashes and tracking down his flushed cheeks. I just wanted a family. We can fix this. We can sell this house. We can move away from her, away from my mother, away from all of it. We can start over. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the edge of my woven placemat. He was bargaining with a ghost. He assumed my silence indicated hesitation. He mistook my calm demeanor for a willingness to negotiate. I looked at his outstretched fingers. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply refused to engage. You cannot repair a structure that lacks a foundation, Julian, I said, keeping my tone level and devoid of any emotional inflection. You are asking me to salvage a bankrupt account. He pulled his hand back as if the placemat burned his skin. His breath hitched in his chest. I tapped my index finger against the thick stack of legal documents resting near his water glass. The sound of my fingernail against the heavy paper echoed sharply. I suggest you read the petition before you attempt to negotiate terms that no longer exist, I instructed. I did not retain Marcus Vance to draft a standard separation agreement. I retained him to execute a targeted financial liquidation. Julian stared at the documents, terrified of the printed ink. The state of Texas operates under community property laws, I explained, delivering the facts with the precision of a classroom lecture. Typically, a judge divides shared assets down the middle. However, the family court system recognizes the severe dissipation of marital equity. When a spouse diverts community credit, liquidates retirement portfolios, and accumulates staggering shadow debt to finance a hidden existence with a third party, the court intervenes to balance the scales. Julian swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. You drained your independent 401k. I continued listing his fiscal sins, one by one. You incurred severe early withdrawal penalties and crippling tax liabilities. You signed multiple personal loans at exorbitant interest rates to ensure a continuous flow of untraceable physical cash. You signed a luxury residential lease in Midland. You purchased boutique hospital care. You did all of this using your own signature, legally binding yourself to the deficit. Harper shrank further into her chair, realizing the depth of the financial ruin I was describing. The wealthy sponsor she targeted was not just broke. He was buried. My legal team structured the settlement to insulate my equity from your reckless spending, I stated. Because of your documented fraud, I am retaining primary ownership of this estate. I am keeping the joint investment portfolios. I am securing my corporate retirement accounts. You are walking away with the clothes packed in the canvas duffel bag upstairs and the shadow debt you manufactured in the desert. The color vanished from his flushed face, replaced by a sickening, chalky pallor. He finally grasped the absolute finality of his situation. He possessed no money to hire a defense attorney. He held zero credit to rent a cheap apartment. He was legally tethered to a luxury townhouse he could no longer afford, facing a mountain of high-interest debt, all to provide for infants that belonged to a nameless stranger. "Nova, please," he wept, dropping his head into his hands. "I have nothing." "You have exactly what you built," I replied. "You financed a scam. Now you will pay the installments." I shifted my gaze down the length of the table. Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, a silent, weeping statue. Her pristine socialite armor lay in jagged ruins around her feet. She mourned the total destruction of her social standing, knowing this scandal would bleed into the country clubs and the charity galas. She traded her son's future to hide a medical secret, and the resulting explosion took down her entire lineage. Harper remained paralyzed across from Julian. Her meal ticket was void. The two women who ruined my life were now trapped in a confined space with the man they broke. They were bound together by the wreckage of their own deception, facing a future defined by the very lies they used to control him. I placed my hands on the mahogany surface and pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped smoothly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dark, tailored dress. The physical action felt momentous, a deliberate severing of the final tether binding me to this room. I did not offer a parting insult. The devastation surrounding them required no supplementary commentary. I left the signed divorce papers resting on the table, a stark white monument to their shared failure. I turned my back on the dining room and walked into the hallway. My heels clicked rhythmically against the floorboards, a steady, measured metronome counting down the final seconds of my marriage. I did not look back. I did not pause to gather personal belongings. Everything I needed resided securely within my own name. I reached the grand foyer. I extended my hand and gripped the heavy brass handle of the front door. The metal felt cool and solid against my palm. I pressed the latch and pulled the heavy oak door open. The Texas night waited on the other side. The warm, humid air washed over my skin, carrying the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine and the lingering heat of the asphalt. The darkness outside felt expansive, vast, and entirely unwritten. Behind me, the muffled sound of Julian weeping echoed from the dining room, blending with the suffocating silence of his mother and his mistress. I stepped over the threshold, leaving them sitting in the tomb they dug for themselves. I pulled the door shut. The heavy latch clicked into place with a definitive metallic thud, sealing them inside. I stood on the concrete porch, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the exterior sconces. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back toward the starless sky. I inhaled, drawing the warm, thick air deep into my chest. For the first time in 7 years, the oxygen filled my lungs without the crushing, solitary weight of their lies. I opened my eyes, ready to balance my own ledger. 30 days passed since the heavy oak door of my suburban home clicked shut. I relocated my base of operations to a high-rise corporate penthouse in downtown Dallas. The new environment featured floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling urban grid below. The space smelled of fresh paint and polished concrete. The atmosphere was sterile, controlled, and entirely devoid of the toxic history that permeated my former residence. The frantic, suffocating tension of the dining room confrontation faded into a quiet, permanent legal reality. The blast radius of the truth continued to expand outward, tearing through the lives of the people who engineered my suffering. The first lingering liability attempting to breach my new perimeter arrived in the form of heavy cream cardstock. Evelyn dispatched 3 handwritten letters over the course of 14 days. The postage stamps bore the exclusive Highland Park zip code. She did not utilize electronic communication, knowing a digital email trail could be weaponized in a court of law. She relied on the analog intimacy of cursive ink and expensive stationery. I opened the envelopes using a silver letter opener. The paper carried the faint scent of her signature designer perfume. I did not read the contents to absorb her apologies. I analyzed the text to measure her desperation. Evelyn constructed her entire identity around the perception of moral superiority. Admitting she orchestrated a medical forgery that ultimately destroyed her own son violated her core programming. She required immediate emotional absolution. She needed me to grant her forgiveness so she could sleep at night without visualizing the devastation at the dining room table. Her paragraphs reeked of manufactured victimhood. She claimed she acted out of pure maternal love. She framed the concealment of the Houston fertility report as a misguided, tragic attempt to protect a fragile male ego. She wanted me to carry the burden of her guilt, just as she forced me to carry the burden of a defective biology. I viewed the letters as toxic debt attempting to attach itself to my clean ledger. I refused to accept the transfer. I instructed Marcus Vance to sever the connection permanently. My attorney drafted a ruthless cease and desist order, citing severe emotional distress and harassment. A licensed process server delivered the legal document directly to her gated estate. The delivery coincided perfectly with the charity luncheon she was hosting for the Pediatric Hospital Board. The legal notice explicitly barred any future contact, threatening immediate restraining orders and public litigation if she attempted to approach my residence or my place of employment. The boundary held firm. The matriarch was silenced, fading into an isolated disgrace, stripped of the social armor she valued above human decency. While Evelyn sought emotional salvation, the other two architects of my misery engaged in a brutal fiscal war. Harper realized the shadow funding had completely evaporated. The luxury West Texas townhouse faced imminent foreclosure. The predatory lenders initiated aggressive collection protocols, threatening to terminate the utilities. My younger sister possessed 0 marketable skills and a resume consisting of abandoned freelance projects. She faced the terrifying reality of poverty with 2 infants in tow. A desperate predator always utilizes the sharpest tool available in their inventory. Harper possessed a lethal weapon, forged in the very hospital room where the misrouted photograph originated. When a child is born in the state of Texas to an unmarried woman, the biological father must establish his legal rights. Julian was blinded by his desperate need to secure his legacy and claim his virility. He willingly signed an acknowledgement of paternity document before the nurses discharged the infants from the maternity ward. He bound himself to the state registry. He affixed his signature to a binding legal contract, swearing, under oath, that he provided the genetic material for the twins. By trying to secure his ownership over the children, he handed Harper a permanent, ironclad financial tether. She marched into a family court and filed an emergency petition for child support. The legal shockwave hit Julian with catastrophic force. A county sheriff deputy served him with the summons directly at his corporate logistics office. The arrival of law enforcement in the reception area effectively broadcasted his personal ruin to his professional colleagues. He opened the manila envelope in his cubicle, staring at the staggering financial demands. Harper demanded a standard of living based on the income he generated before my legal team initiated the asset freeze. She demanded exorbitant child care expenses, premium medical coverage, and housing allowances. The trap snapped shut with perfect mathematical cruelty. In order to fight the child support order, Julian needed to formally contest the paternity acknowledgement. Contesting a signed legal document requires hiring a specialized litigation attorney. It demands mandatory court-ordered DNA testing and a grueling, drawn-out legal battle to prove he was a victim of fraud. Julian lacked the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone a trial lawyer. His accounts remained locked by my divorce petition. His credit score sat in absolute ruins after the personal loans defaulted. He was financially crippled, trapped in a paradox of his own making. He ruined his life to sponsor a family he thought was his own. Now the legal system ordered him to finance the survival of a grifter and her illegitimate children. The ecosystem they built crumbled into a vicious, toxic arena. Harper and Julian were locked in a cage, matching wits against a deficit neither could afford. Every dollar the court ordered him to surrender to her legal demands pushed him closer to total bankruptcy. Every motion he filed as a self-represented litigant to delay the payments tightened the financial snare around her failing desert sanctuary. They were bleeding each other dry, utilizing the court system as a weapon of mutual destruction. I observed the carnage from a safe clinical distance. Marcus Vance forwarded the public court filings to my secure email server as a professional courtesy. I read the dockets while drinking my morning espresso, watching the sun rise over the Dallas skyline. The people who viewed my body as a broken asset, The individuals who treated my loyalty as a disposable resource were currently liquidating one another. They built a structure on fraudulent data, and the resulting collapse trapped them both under the heavy rubble. I felt no obligation to intervene. I felt no lingering urge to punish them further. The universe possesses a remarkable mechanism for self-correction when you remove your stabilizing support from a parasitic relationship. I stopped funding my sister. I stopped absorbing the emotional damage of my husband. I stopped playing the compliant daughter-in-law. The moment I withdrew my capital, the entire fraudulent enterprise collapsed under its own weight. My ledger remained pristine. My equity continued to appreciate. The final audit approached, requiring one last strategic deployment of capital to ensure this specific brand of trauma could never be replicated against anyone else. 6 months passed since the gavel fell in the Dallas County Courthouse. The presiding judge finalized the dissolution of my marriage, awarding me every requested asset. I sold the suburban property holding the echoes of my synthetic hormone treatments. I packed my life into pristine archival boxes and drove 200 miles south. I purchased a top-floor penthouse in downtown Austin. The capital of Texas offered a fitting arena for my next structural project. The new residence features bare concrete pillars and vast stretches of uninterrupted glass. The aesthetic is stark, clean, and unforgiving. I stand by the window, tracing the current of the Colorado River, winding through the urban density below. My physical form belongs solely to me again. The yellow and purple mottling across my abdomen faded months ago, leaving smooth, unblemished skin. I no longer track my basal body temperature or swallow unregulated supplements, hoping to fix a biological machine that never required maintenance. I wake up in crisp white sheets, breathing air that smells only of ozone and expensive espresso. The quiet in my home is intentional, curated, and secure. The board of directors confirmed my appointment as Chief Risk Officer, finalizing the executive contract during a brisk morning meeting. My professional mandate involves shielding a multinational corporation from internal corruption and external liabilities. I execute the role with the cold precision born from my personal audit. Identifying a bad investment and severing the infected branch comes naturally to a woman who watched her own family consume itself. The compensation package accompanying my new title rendered the divorce settlement redundant for my daily survival. I liquidated the joint portfolios I seized from Julian. I sold the primary estate to a young couple eager to start a family, ignoring the grim history soaked into the floorboards. The resulting capital flooded my private accounts. I possessed millions in liquid currency. Storing the funds in passive index funds felt insufficient. Money sitting idle lacks purpose. I required a mechanism to convert that capital into permanent structural change. I needed to ensure the specific architecture of my trauma could never be weaponized against another woman. The medical deception engineered by Evelyn relied on a fragile institutional framework. The Houston Fertility Clinic prioritized the comfort of a wealthy guarantor over the fundamental rights of a patient. They allowed a mother-in-law to intercept a catastrophic diagnosis to preserve a fragile male ego. They stood by while I injected myself with synthetic hormones, altering my brain chemistry, and enduring surgical retrievals for a condition I did not possess. That level of institutional complicity thrives in silence. It flourishes in the dark margins of patient privacy laws, where bureaucratic loopholes allow cowardice to masquerade as policy. I decided to flood those margins with blinding light. I diverted a vast percentage of the divorce settlement into an irrevocable trust. I hired a specialized team of medical ethicists, relentless litigators, and seasoned political lobbyists. We leased a commercial suite 3 blocks from the Texas State Capitol building. I named the organization the Clear Ledger Initiative. The foundation does not offer grief counseling or sympathetic support groups. We operate as a tactical legal strike force. Our mandate focuses strictly on eradicating third-party medical concealment in reproductive health. We draft legislation requiring mandatory direct-to-patient diagnostic disclosures, carrying severe criminal penalties for any physician who routes test results through a secondary proxy. We fund civil litigation for women subjected to unnecessary fertility treatments due to partner deception. Our first major lawsuit targeted the Houston facility. We filed a comprehensive malpractice claim, citing gross negligence and fraudulent concealment. The discovery process unearthed a decades-long pattern of accommodating wealthy donors at the expense of patient autonomy. Brenda Hayes and her presiding physicians faced the swift, harsh reality of public accountability. The medical board revoked licenses. The clinic paid a heavy out-of-court settlement to avoid a jury trial. We channeled every dollar of that settlement right back into the initiative, funding a statewide audit of reproductive clinics. No other woman will ever sit in a sterile waiting room, absorbing the blame for a failure that belongs to the man sitting beside her. No mother-in-law will ever purchase the silence of a doctor to protect her family crest. We weaponize the law to turn their cowardice into a catastrophic liability. The individuals who attempted to turn me into a disposable asset remain trapped in the consequences of their own arithmetic. My attorneys informed me that Julian lost his final appeal in family court. The judge ordered him to liquidate his remaining personal property to satisfy the retroactive child support demands Harper filed against him. He works a mid-level clerical job in a dusty warehouse in Midland, turning over 60% of his diminished paycheck to the woman who conned him. Harper lives in a cramped apartment stripped of the luxury townhouse she thought she secured. They are bound together for the next 18 years, chained to the biological reality of two children they must raise in mutual, suffocating resentment. Evelyn became a social pariah. The details of the Houston Clinic lawsuit leaked into the Highland Park social circles. The charity boards quietly requested her resignation. The women she spent her life trying to impress now cross the street to avoid her gaze. The false kingdom she guarded with such desperate cruelty crumbled into ash, leaving her to reign over an empty, silent estate. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass of my Austin penthouse, holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. The sun dips below the western horizon, painting the Texas sky in vibrant streaks of bruised purple and burning gold. The city below transitions into night. Streetlights flicker to life, illuminating the sprawling arteries of the capital. The traffic moves in steady, predictable patterns, tracing the geometry of a world that operates on logic and measured risk. I take a slow sip of the cold water, feeling the chill trace a path down my throat. My breathing remains deep, even, and unburdened. I survived a system designed to break me, and I dismantled the machinery they used to carry out the task. I look at my reflection in the dark glass. The woman staring back is not a victim. She is not a barren wife. She is the architect of her own unassailable reality. I run the final calculations in my mind, checking the columns one last time. The deficits are erased. The liabilities are liquidated. The foundation is solid, holding fast against the fading light. My internal ledger balances with exact precision. A quiet, distinct click echoes in the silent apartment as I set my glass down on the stone counter. The sound marks the end of the transaction. The account is permanently, successfully closed.